This is the podcast for looking at the differences between summarizing and paraphrasing, and also specifically thinking about how to avoid plagiarism when doing them. As you can see on the title card, it says, I know that this is review, but it's important because bad paraphrasing is plagiarism and all plagiarism is bad. Something that I saw in some of your previous papers is that sometimes when you're trying to paraphrase rather than quote, there are some tendencies that you've developed that don't actually really paraphrase accurately and are leading towards plagiarism. So I want to be sure to take a look at those today. The first thing to examine is what is summary. A summary condenses a longer text into a much smaller space. Usually this is about a paragraph. Sometimes for extended academic summaries you can go up to a page, but what you want to shoot for in A3 is a paragraph that's about half a page long. Usually this should include the publication information, the main claim and thesis, and it may also include the key reasons that the author uses to support their thesis. Now remember that authors often use many reasons to support their thesis, and in a summary you want to focus in on which of those you think are truly key. You may also include an organization of the text. This may not be as important for something standard like we saw with Where the Student Voices, where it's pretty much an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. However, you may have wanted to mention in that they brought up several questions, which is how they partially organize their text. And with the Sloan text, it's important to bring up that it's organized as a letter because that's significant in how it carries its purpose across. So that's the kind of thing you might want to summarize with that. Finally, you may want to think about how to do a brief summary of evidence. This is something that is really tricky and is still showing up as very difficult in some of your papers. For a brief summary of evidence, you don't even necessarily need to give an example of evidence. So for example, in the Sloan piece, you could simply say, Sloan's evidence is based upon his experience as a community college instructor. You don't have to give any specific examples, and that way the audience will be aware of what kinds of evidence he's using without you having to take up a lot of space. Sometimes it can be easier for people to think of a summary as a way to introduce a source to their reader. So if you're getting tripped up on how much evidence and details to put into a source, think about it as you're saying, hello reader, this is a text and I'd like to introduce it to you. Then you only need to include those main key things. Like when you're introducing a friend, you wouldn't tell your new person that you're introducing them to all about like their childhood backstory. All you maybe want to do is like, here's what they do, here's why you might be interested in them. And that gives them a little introduction. Similarly, you could do that with thinking about summary. Paraphrase is similar to summary in that it takes some words from the author and then puts them into your own words, but a summary is going to be much more condensed. A paraphrase is actually more like a translation that takes the author's ideas and translates them into your own words, your own voice. It's going to be about the same length, which is one of the ways you can differentiate between paraphrase and summary. Also, it's going to be in your own voice. That's very important, and we're going to look at some of the ways that you can make sure you're doing that well. You do want to be careful that when you are paraphrasing, you avoid the author's original words, and for most of you that's going well. However, you also want to make sure that you're avoiding the writer's grammatical structure and syntax. Grammatical structure would be the way that they've structured the sentence. Syntax might be the order of the words, how they've decided to put those words together in a sentence. You can actually plagiarize both. This is not something that many people are aware of, and it's not intuitively obvious to think about sentence structure as being something that you can plagiarize. But it does count as plagiarism in academic circles. So, if you're only swapping out synonyms and you're mostly using the exact same sentence structure, it's still plagiarism. So you don't want to be doing that. Keep in mind that when you're paraphrasing, you should also be using attribution. Much like we read about in Hacker, you need to be using some kind of signal phrase or author tag to introduce a text, and you should also have some kind of parenthetical documentation to show exactly where that source comes from. Most of y'all are doing a very good job with that when it comes to quotations. However, it also needs to happen for paraphrase. Anytime you're using someone's ideas that are not your own, it needs to be cited. The only exception to that is when it is something that is commonly known. So if I were to state in the paper that the United States has 50 states in it, and I'm writing to an American audience, I won't need to cite that because Americans should know that there are 50 states in the United States of America. It should be considered common knowledge. However, if I was writing maybe to a foreign audience, I might need to go into a little bit more explanation or citation so that they could refer back to that. The idea with citations is that it makes you more credible. It also, for academic purposes, gives your audience a way to follow up, to learn more, and to get more information if they're interested. So, a lot of when you decide not to cite should be based on what's going to work for your audience. When in doubt, cite. It's way better to be oversighting than underciting. Underciting can sometimes lead to plagiarism. That's something we really want to work on avoiding in this class. So let's take a look at an example of how we can be consistently using author tags and citations to help make sure that we're giving good attribution. So if we look at the example here, the example says, Martin claims that students are actually passionate about change. For example, she cites information from the National Association of Campus Activities suggesting that students are increasingly involved in campus activities and are very concerned about the war in Iraq. However, students engage in a safe kind of activism that doesn't bring about any change. So in that example, we can see that those first two sentences, although not quoted, are borrowed information. I've used author tags to indicate that. I've also used parenthetical citations there. So it's very clear that those two sentences are cited. And because I've done that consistently, it's very clear on that third sentence, okay, now I'm moving into my own opinion. It makes it really easy for your reader to know when things are coming from another source and when things are your idea if you are consistent about attribution, in addition to helping you avoid problems with plagiarism. So I want now to take some time looking at some examples between the differences of paraphrasing, summary, and plagiarism. They are, again, similar, but they are different. So I want to take a look at some examples. This example actually comes from the Purdue Owl. The original text that's quoted from Writing Research Papers by James D. Lester says, students frequently overuse direct quotation in taking notes, and as a result, they overuse quotations in the final research paper. Probably only about 10% of your final manuscript should appear as directly quoted matter. Therefore, you should strive to limit the amount of exact transcribing of source materials while taking notes. So that's a quote from an original source. It also brings up a good point, incidentally, that you want to be shooting for fewer quotes in your paper, somewhere about 10 to maybe 15%. That's one of the reasons that paraphrase is so important, because you can get information from the source, but still have your own words in there so that you're not overwhelming your reader with someone else's voice. Now we can look at a rewrite of this and decide whether it's summary, paraphrase, or plagiarism. So the original is listed above. This is the rewrite. Lester says that in research papers, students often quote excessively, failing to keep quoted material down to a desirable level. He claims that since the problem usually originates during note-taking, it is essential to minimize the material recorded verbatim. So take a look at that example. Think about what you notice, how it's different from the original, what's changed, and whether you think it's a summary, a paraphrase, or plagiarism. If you looked at this one and said that it's paraphrase, you are correct. So let's think about why that is. Some students think this is summary, but remember that paraphrase tends to match up with about the same length. If we look at the rewrite, it's about 6 or 7 lines, and then the original is about the same length. So we can see that they are similar. It does do a good job, though, of translating both into a different structure of sentence and different words. So it isn't plagiarism. We can tell that this is different, that it's been translated into some other author's voice rather than the original by Lester. If we look at the second rewrite, it's slightly different. So as you can see, the original is still above, and let's read that rewrite. It says, Lester says that students often use too many direct quotations when they take notes, resulting in too many of them in the final research paper. In fact, he claims that probably only about 10% of the final copy should consist of directly quoted material. So Lester suggests it is important to limit the amount of source material copied while taking notes. So look at that rewrite again, think about the differences between the original and this rewrite, and decide what you think that it is. If you said that this one is plagiarized, then you're correct. Some of you might be surprised by that because it does use in-text citation. And in-text citation you think might be a safe way to actually borrow some of the author's sentence structure in addition to their words. However, this is one of those kind of gray areas in terms of plagiarism, and many people will consider this plagiarized. Even though you give credit to the author, it doesn't necessarily convey that you're giving credit to their sentence structure, more to their ideas. So at the very least, it's sloppy scholarship, which is something we want to avoid in this class. We want to become really strong scholars. And it might be considered plagiarism by some of your readers, so you want to avoid this. Basically, the problem is that there's a lot of sentence structure overlap here, and you can see that it's mostly been switched out for synonyms. So instead of overuse direct quotation, it says use too many direct quotations. It's very, very similar. So this one, in most academic circles, would be considered plagiarized. The third rewrite is again a little different. Paired next to the original, the rewrite says, Lester argues that students should take just a few notes in direct quotation from sources to help minimize the amount of quoted material in a research paper. So since we've already covered the other two, this one is probably a summary, and in this case, it does a nice job of taking that longer quote and condensing it down to the bare main claim ideas. Notice that in this summary, it doesn't have anything about any details. We don't get that 10% quoted, and that's okay because summary just needs to give you that main idea, and this does that well. And if you look back to rewrite 1, it actually is pretty clear that this is very different in terms of length. So we can see looking at rewrite 1 compared to rewrite 3 that there's a difference in length and there's a difference in the amount of detail that's included in rewrite 1 versus rewrite 3. Rewrite 1, of course, being our paraphrased version as opposed to rewrite 3. So as we can see, even though summary and paraphrase are similar in that they take another person's words and put them into your own words, they do have different goals. Summary is to condense down. Paraphrase is merely a translation, so you get all those same ideas but put it into your new words to avoid overquoting. Also, we want to make sure that we're avoiding plagiarism because it's really easy to do with paraphrase, especially if you're not thinking about rewriting the sentence structure. So as you do your homework tonight, be really thinking about how you can avoid plagiarism both in terms of sentence structure and in terms of wording.